The mop clattered against the polished floor as Mara Whitfield froze mid-step. A voice cut through the empty concert hall, sharp and mocking, echoing off walls built for music, not laughter aimed at her. "You actually touch that piano when nobody is watching? That's almost sad." Mara turned. Julian Hastings stood in the doorway, his blazer draped over one shoulder, his expression already curling into a smile that had humiliated dozens of students before her. He was the conservatory's brightest name, the boy whose photograph hung near the entrance, the one professors spoke about like he had already won every prize the world had left to give. Mara's hand tightened around the mop handle. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sting of being caught doing the one thing that still made her feel alive. Every night after the students left and the halls went silent, she stayed behind an extra hour, running her fingers over the keys of the grand piano in the empty recital room. She never played loudly. She never dared to be heard. It was her secret, the only piece of her old life she had left. "I was just cleaning," she said quietly, setting the mop against the wall. "Cleaning," Julian repeated, stepping further into the room, his shoes tapping against the wood floor with unhurried arrogance. "That's a generous word for what I saw. You were sitting there like you actually belonged on that bench." Mara said nothing. Silence was safer. She had learned that lesson long before she ever set foot in this building. Julian walked closer to the piano, resting his hand on its lid the way someone might rest their hand on a trophy they believed was rightfully theirs. "Do you know how long people study to sit at an instrument like this? Years. Some of them their whole lives. And you think a few minutes alone at night makes you a musician?" "I never said I was a musician," Mara answered, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "Good, because you're not." He said it plainly, without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse. Cruelty delivered calmly, always cut deeper than cruelty shouted. She bent down to pick up her cleaning cart, hoping the conversation was over, hoping he would grow bored and leave the way people like him always did, once they had gotten their entertainment, but Julian was not finished. "Actually," he said, tilting his head as if an idea had just struck him, "why don't you play something? Right now. Let's see this hidden talent you think you have." A few students had gathered near the hallway entrance, drawn by the sound of his voice carrying through the corridor. Word spread fast in a building full of people who thrived on drama almost as much as music. Within a minute, 5 or 6 students stood near the doorway, phones already lifting halfway out of pockets, sensing a moment worth capturing. Mara felt her face grow warm. She was not afraid of the piano. She had never been afraid of the piano. She was afraid of what would happen if she let herself be seen again. Truly seen, after spending years convincing herself that part of her life was over. "I don't need to prove anything to you," she said. "No," Julian agreed, folding his arms. "You don't. But it might be good for you to understand where you actually stand. Sometimes people need reminders." One of the students near the door, a boy named Daniel, laughed under his breath. A girl beside him, Priya, didn't laugh, but she didn't say anything either. Nobody wanted to be the one who defended the janitor against the school's favorite student. Mara looked at the piano. Its dark wood gleamed under the hall lights, keys pale and waiting, the same instrument she had touched almost every night for the past year, always alone, always quietly, always with the door closed. She thought about walking away. She thought about how easy it would be to grab her cart and disappear down the hallway, letting Julian have his laugh, letting the moment pass like so many others had. But something in her resisted, a small, stubborn ember she thought had gone out years ago. "Fine," she said. The word surprised even her. Julian's smile widened, delighted, already certain of what would happen. He gestured toward the piano bench with a mocking flourish, as if inviting royalty to sit, except the gesture was soaked in ridicule rather than respect. "By all means." Mara set down her cart and walked toward the piano. Her hands trembled slightly, not from doubt about her ability, but from the weight of memory rushing back all at once. She had not sat down to actually perform in front of anyone in nearly 6 years. Not since the day her family's world had fallen apart. Not since the last time her grandmother had watched her from the front row of a small competition hall, eyes shining with pride neither of them knew would be one of their final moments together at a piano. She lowered herself onto the bench. The wood felt familiar beneath her, cool and solid, the same way it always did during her secret hours in the empty hall. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys, feeling their smoothness, feeling the quiet hum of anticipation that always came right before sound. Julian crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, clearly expecting a stumble, a hesitant scale, something to confirm what he already believed about her. The small crowd by the door grew a little larger. Someone whispered. Someone else lifted a phone higher. Mara closed her eyes for a brief second, steadying her breath the way her grandmother had taught her years ago. Then she opened them, looked straight ahead, and pressed down on a single key. One note. It rang through the hall with a depth and control that silenced every whisper instantly. It was not just a note. It carried weight, intention, a controlled power that seemed impossible from someone holding a mop moments earlier. The sound lingered in the air, rich and resonant, filling every corner of the concert hall, the way only a truly trained hand could produce. Julian's smile faltered. Daniel stopped scrolling on his phone. Priya's mouth opened slightly, her earlier hesitation replaced with something closer to disbelief. Even the students who had come only to laugh found themselves leaning forward, drawn by a single sound that felt like the opening line of a story none of them expected to hear. From the far end of the hallway, unnoticed by anyone in the room, the conservatory's dean, Mr. Caldwell, paused mid-step. He had been walking toward his office, ready to head home for the evening, when the note reached him. He knew immediately that it was not the touch of a beginner. He had spent 30 years listening to thousands of students play their very best, and he understood in an instant that whoever had just played that single note possessed something rare, something most performers spent a lifetime chasing, and never fully found. He turned back toward the concert hall, his footsteps quickening. Inside the room, Mara sat completely still for a moment, her hand resting on the key she had just played, the sound slowly fading into silence. For the first time in years, she felt the eyes of a room fixed entirely on her, not with mockery, but with stunned attention. Julian opened his mouth to say something, some remark to dismiss what had just happened, but nothing came out. The confidence that had carried him into the room only minutes earlier had cracked, just slightly, just enough for something else to show through. Mara looked up from the keys, meeting his gaze for the first time since she had sat down. Was that convincing enough? She asked quietly. The hallway outside had gone completely silent, every phone still raised, every student waiting to see what would happen next, sensing, without knowing exactly why, that they were witnessing the beginning of something none of them would forget. Mara did not answer Julian's silence with pride. She simply stood, smoothed the front of her uniform, and reached for her cleaning cart as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had happened, and everyone in that hallway knew it, even if none of them could yet explain what they had just witnessed. Mr. Caldwell arrived at the doorway just as she began to walk away. He said nothing to the gathered students, only watched Mara pass. His eyes narrowed with a focus that had nothing to do with discipline, and everything to do with memory. Something about the shape of her hands on the keys, the way she had struck that single note with such command, tugged at a recollection buried deep in his mind. He did not chase after her, not yet. He needed time to be certain. That night, Mara walked home along the same quiet streets she always took, past the small grocery store with its flickering sign, past the bus stop where teenagers gathered every evening to talk too loudly about nothing important. She did not think about Julian's mocking tone, or the students who had watched her like she was some kind of spectacle. Instead, her mind drifted backward, the way it always did whenever a piano was involved, back to a house she no longer lived in, back to a woman whose voice she still heard clearly whenever she closed her eyes. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had been the one who first placed her fingers on piano keys when she was only 5 years old. Eleanor had once played professionally in small concert halls across the country, before choosing a quieter life to raise a family. She never spoke of regret, she only spoke of music, of discipline, of patience, and of the importance of playing not to impress others but to understand oneself. By the time Mara turned 16, she had already won 3 regional competitions. Judges praised her control, her emotional depth, the way she seemed to feel every note before her fingers ever touched the keys. Teachers whispered that she had a future far beyond the modest town where she had grown up. Eleanor sat in the front row of every performance, clapping the loudest, always the first to stand. Then everything changed within the span of a single year. Mara's father lost his job when the factory where he worked closed its doors permanently. Around the same time, her mother, Diane, began experiencing symptoms that no one could explain. Exhaustion that never lifted, pain that came and went without warning. Doctors eventually diagnosed her with a chronic illness that required constant treatment, medication, and care that the family's insurance barely covered. The household that once revolved around music lessons and competition schedules began revolving instead around hospital visits and mounting bills. Mara remembered the exact evening her parents sat her down at the kitchen table, their faces heavy with an apology they didn't need to give but gave anyway. They told her, gently, that the piano lessons could no longer continue, not because they didn't believe in her talent, but because survival had to come first. She had nodded that night, forcing a small smile, telling them she understood, telling them it was fine. Inside, something in her chest had cracked quietly, the same way ice cracks beneath weight it was never meant to hold. Eleanor had tried to help however she could, offering to teach Mara for free, insisting that music should never be sacrificed. But within another year, Eleanor's own health began to decline, and soon she too required care that stretched the family thin in every direction. The piano at home was eventually sold to cover a portion of medical costs, the same piano Mara had learned her very first scales on. She could still remember watching two men carry it out the front door, its polished wood catching the afternoon sunlight one final time before disappearing into a truck that drove away and never returned. At 17, Mara took on part-time work wherever she could find it, first at a laundromat, then at a small bakery, learning quickly that survival left little room for dreams that didn't pay bills. She told herself she would return to music eventually, once things settled, once her mother's health improved, once the world stopped demanding every ounce of energy she had. But things rarely settle the way people hope they will. By the time Mara turned 23, Eleanor had passed away quietly in her sleep, leaving behind sheet music, old recital programs, and a single photograph of a much younger Mara sitting proudly at a piano bench, medal around her neck, smile wide and certain of a future that felt guaranteed at the time. Diane's condition stabilized eventually, though it required ongoing treatment that never fully disappeared. Mara found steady work at the conservatory nearly 2 years ago, drawn not by music but by necessity. The pay was decent, the hours consistent, and something about being near musicians again, even as someone who mopped their floors rather than played beside them, felt like the closest she could get to the life she once imagined. She never told anyone at work about her past. She never mentioned the competitions, the medals, or the grandmother who had shaped her earliest understanding of rhythm and feeling. It was easier that way. Easier to let people assume she was simply a quiet woman who cleaned their halls after hours, rather than someone who had once been told by respected judges that she carried a rare gift. Meanwhile, across town, Julian Hastings returned to his family's large house that evening in a mood far different from his usual confidence. He replayed the sound of that single note over and over in his mind, unable to shake the feeling it had left behind. He had grown up in a household where music was less about passion and more about legacy. His father, a respected businessman, had built much of his identity around funding the arts, and Julian had been placed at a piano before he could even read properly, not because he begged for lessons, but because his family expected a certain image from their only son. He was talented, undeniably so, but talent alone had never felt like enough. Behind every award he won, every recital that ended in applause, there existed a quiet unease he rarely allowed himself to examine too closely. He worked incredibly hard, practicing for hours daily, yet some part of him always wondered whether his success came from genuine skill, or simply from resources and privilege that most students could never access. That insecurity, buried beneath layers of arrogance and carefully rehearsed confidence, was the very thing that had pushed him to mock Mara in the first place. It was easier to belittle someone else's ability than to sit with uncertainty about his own. The following morning, Julian arrived at the conservatory earlier than usual, hoping to catch Mara before her shift began. He told himself he simply wanted answers, nothing more. He wanted to understand how someone who spent her nights mopping floors could produce a sound that had silenced an entire hallway. He found her near the supply closet, organizing cleaning equipment with quiet efficiency. She glanced up when she noticed him approaching, her expression guarded but not unkind. "Can I help you with something?" she asked. Julian hesitated, an unfamiliar feeling for someone usually so certain of his words. "That note yesterday," he finally said. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Mara studied him for a long moment before answering. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," he admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. She closed the supply closet door, considering how much she wanted to reveal to someone who, only a day earlier, had gone out of his way to embarrass her in front of an audience. Part of her wanted to walk away without another word. But another part of her, the part that still remembered Eleanor's lessons about grace even in difficult moments, decided that honesty might matter more than resentment. "My grandmother taught me," she said simply. "I used to compete when I was younger." Julian's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Compete where?" "Regional competitions mostly. A few state-level events." She paused, deciding how much further to go. "It doesn't matter anymore. That was a long time ago." "It clearly still matters," Julian said, gesturing vaguely toward the concert hall down the corridor. "Nobody forgets how to play like that overnight." Mara offered a faint, humorless smile. Life doesn't always let people keep doing the things they're good at. Julian fell silent, unsure how to respond to a sentence that carried more weight than its simple wording suggested. For the first time since he had met her, he found himself looking at Mara not as an easy target for amusement, but as someone whose story clearly extended far beyond the uniform she wore. Word of what had happened in the concert hall spread quickly through the conservatory that day. Students who hadn't witnessed it firsthand heard exaggerated versions from those who had. Some doubted the story entirely, assuming it had been blown out of proportion. Others, particularly those who had seen the moment with their own eyes, spoke about it with genuine curiosity, wondering who exactly their janitor really was. Priya, one of the students who had watched from the doorway, found Mara later that afternoon while she was wiping down a row of chairs in an empty classroom. "That was incredible yesterday," Priya said, her voice sincere rather than mocking. "I've never heard anyone play a single note like that." Mara offered a small nod of thanks, unused to compliments delivered without an edge of judgment attached. "Are you going to play again?" Priya asked. "Properly, I mean, not just one note." Mara hesitated, memories of competition halls and her grandmother's proud applause flickering briefly behind her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted honestly. "It's complicated." Priya seemed to understand not to push further, offering only a warm smile before leaving the room. But her question lingered in Mara's mind for the rest of the day, refusing to fade the way most passing comments usually did. That evening, once the halls had emptied and silence settled over the building, Mara found herself once again standing outside the concert hall doors, staring at the piano through the small window in the entrance. Something about the previous day's events had shifted something inside her, cracking open a door she had spent years trying to keep firmly shut. She thought about her grandmother's voice, gentle yet firm, always reminding her that music was never meant to be hidden away out of fear. She thought about her mother, who despite years of illness, had never once asked her to give up on her dreams entirely, only to prioritize survival when survival demanded it. Mara placed her hand against the cool glass of the door, staring at the piano bathed in dim evening light. For the first time in years, she wondered if perhaps her story with music wasn't finished after all. 3 days after the incident in the concert hall, Mr. Caldwell called Mara into his office. She arrived still wearing her work uniform, unsure what to expect, her stomach tightening with a nervousness she hadn't felt in years. She wondered if perhaps she had broken some unspoken rule by touching an instrument that wasn't meant for staff, if perhaps this meeting would end with a warning or worse. Instead, Mr. Caldwell gestured toward the chair across from his desk, his expression thoughtful rather than stern. "Please, sit," he said. Mara lowered herself into the chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I heard what happened in the concert hall," he began, watching her carefully. "I also happened to walk past at the exact moment you played." Mara's cheeks warmed slightly. "I wasn't trying to cause a scene." "I'm not suggesting you did," he replied gently. "But I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." He leaned forward slightly. "Have you competed before? Formally, I mean." Mara hesitated, the familiar instinct to hide her past rising instantly. But something about the sincerity in his expression convinced her that honesty would serve her better than deflection. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "When I was younger. Regional competitions mostly. A few state-level events." Mr. Caldwell nodded slowly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. "Your name is Mara Whitfield, correct?" "Yes." He rose from his chair and walked toward a shelf lined with old programs and photographs collected over decades of running the conservatory. After a moment of searching, he pulled out a thin, worn booklet and placed it gently on the desk in front of her. Mara's breath caught in her throat. It was a program from a youth piano competition she had entered when she was 15 years old, the same competition where she had placed second overall, the same event where her grandmother had cried tears of pride in the front row. "I judged that competition," Mr. Caldwell said quietly. "I remember your performance clearly. I remember thinking that a young musician with your control and emotional depth would go on to do remarkable things." He paused, studying her face. "I never expected to see you again mopping the floors of my concert hall." Mara felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes, though she fought them back with practiced control. "Life took a different direction," she said simply. "Would you be willing to tell me why?" he asked, his tone free of judgment, filled instead with genuine curiosity. For the first time in years, Mara found herself explaining everything: the factory closing, her mother's illness, the piano sold to cover medical bills, her grandmother's decline and eventual passing, the slow accumulation of circumstances that had pulled her further and further away from the life she once imagined for herself. Mr. Caldwell listened without interrupting, his expression softening with each detail she shared. When she finished, silence settled over the office for a long moment. "I want to offer you something," he finally said. "Not out of pity. but because I believe talent like yours shouldn't remain hidden simply because circumstances forced it into the shadows." Mara looked up, uncertain what he meant. "There's a scholarship program here," he continued, "designed for exceptional musicians who, for whatever reason, couldn't continue formal training. It would cover tuition, provide access to instructors, and allow you to study seriously again." He paused. "I'd like to nominate you." Mara sat frozen, the offer settling over her like something too large to fully comprehend all at once. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to decide today," he said kindly, "but I'd encourage you to consider it seriously." Word of the meeting eventually reached other students, though the details remained vague enough to fuel speculation rather than certainty. Julian heard fragments of the story from Daniel, who had heard it from someone else entirely, the kind of information that traveled through hallways faster than any official announcement ever could. He found himself unable to focus during his own practice sessions that week, the memory of Mara's single note replaying constantly in his mind, disrupting his usual confidence at the keys. His instructor noticed his distraction during a private lesson and asked if something was troubling him. "I'm fine," Julian said quickly, though his fingers fumbled over a passage he had played flawlessly hundreds of times before. That evening, driven by an urge he couldn't fully explain, Julian returned to the concert hall long after everyone else had left, hoping to find Mara there again. He wasn't entirely sure what he intended to say. Part of him wanted to apologize. Part of him wanted to understand her story more fully. Part of him simply couldn't stop thinking about the way that single note had made him question things about himself he usually avoided examining too closely. He found her exactly where he expected, sitting at the piano bench, though this time she wasn't playing. She sat quietly, staring at the keys, lost in thought. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Julian said from the doorway. Mara glanced up, surprised but not startled. "You're here late." "So are you," he replied, stepping cautiously into the room. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, before Julian finally spoke again. "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words feeling unfamiliar in his mouth, "for how I treated you. It wasn't fair." Mara studied him carefully, searching for sincerity beneath his usual polished confidence. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Julian exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "Because that note you played shook something loose in me. I've spent years being told I'm talented, being told I'm exceptional, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself that meant I understood everything about music." He paused. "But watching you play that single note, I realized I don't actually know what real feeling in music sounds like, not the way you played it." Mara considered his words carefully before responding. "Talent isn't the same as feeling," she said quietly. "You can have incredible technical skill and still never truly connect with what you're playing. Feeling comes from somewhere else entirely." "Where?" Julian asked, genuinely curious. Mara looked down at the keys, memories of her grandmother's gentle guidance surfacing once again. "From everything you've lived through, the things you've lost, the things you've fought to hold on to. Music isn't just notes played correctly. It's a language for everything words can't fully express." Julian sat down slowly on a nearby bench, absorbing her words with unusual humility. "I don't think I've ever lost anything the way it sounds like you have. That's not something to apologize for," Mara said. "But it might explain why your playing, as skilled as it is, doesn't always land the way you hope it will." Julian fell silent, considering her words carefully. For the first time since arriving at the conservatory, he felt something other than confidence guiding his thoughts, something closer to genuine reflection. "Would you play something else?" he finally asked. "Not because I'm testing you, because I actually want to hear it." Mara hesitated, old fears resurfacing briefly before she pushed them aside. She turned back toward the piano, placing her hands gently on the keys once again. This time, she didn't play a single note. She played an entire piece, one her grandmother had taught her years ago. A piece filled with rising and falling melodies that captured both sorrow and hope in equal measure. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, yet every note carried an emotional weight that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond technical skill alone. Julian listened in complete silence, his earlier arrogance replaced entirely by quiet awe. He watched her hands move across the keys, watched the way her expression shifted subtly with each phrase, watched a woman who had spent years hiding her true self finally allow a small piece of it to surface. When the final note faded into silence, neither of them spoke for a long moment. "That was incredible," Julian finally said, his voice quieter than usual. Mara offered a small, genuine smile, the first she had allowed herself in his presence. "Thank you." Word of their late-night conversation never spread through the school the way earlier rumors had, mostly because neither of them mentioned it to anyone. But something between them had shifted permanently. a mutual understanding forming where mockery had once existed. Over the following days, Julian found himself watching Mara differently whenever their paths crossed in the hallways. Gone was his usual smirk, replaced instead by a quiet respect he hadn't extended to many people before. Other students noticed the change as well, though few understood exactly what had caused it. Meanwhile, Mara continued considering Mr. Caldwell's scholarship offer, torn between old fears of disappointment and a cautious hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She thought constantly about her grandmother's voice, about her mother's unwavering support despite years of hardship, about the version of herself who once believed music could carry her toward an extraordinary future. One evening, after another long shift, she found herself sitting across from her mother at their small kitchen table, finally ready to share everything that had happened at the conservatory. Diane listened quietly, her tired eyes brightening with each detail Mara revealed. "You have to say yes," Diane said gently once Mara finished explaining the scholarship offer. "Your grandmother would want this for you more than anything." "I'm scared," Mara admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "What if I'm not good enough anymore? What if too much time has passed?" Diane reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand firmly. "You played one note in that hall, and it silenced an entire room of people who thought they understood music better than anyone else. That doesn't sound like someone who lost her gift. That sounds like someone who simply forgot how powerful she really is." Mara felt tears finally slip free, not from sadness, but from a quiet, overwhelming relief. That night, long after her mother had gone to sleep, Mara sat alone in her small bedroom, staring at the old photograph of herself at 15 years old, medal around her neck, smile wide with certainty about a future she had once believed was guaranteed. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps that future hadn't disappeared entirely. Perhaps it had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. Mara accepted the scholarship the following week, signing her name at the bottom of a document that felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. Mr. Caldwell shook her hand warmly, telling her that he looked forward to watching her rediscover everything she had once been forced to set aside. Walking out of his office that afternoon, Mara felt a strange mixture of excitement and disbelief, as though she were stepping into a life that belonged to someone else entirely. News of her acceptance into the scholarship program spread through the conservatory quickly, and this time, the reactions were far different from the mocking whispers that had followed the concert hall incident weeks earlier. Students who had once ignored her presence entirely now greeted her with genuine curiosity, some even asking if she would consider giving them advice on technique or interpretation. Julian, more than anyone else, found himself watching her transformation with quiet fascination. He noticed the way her posture had changed slightly, straighter, more confident, as though carrying a secret weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. He noticed the way she began arriving earlier, not to clean the halls, but to practice in one of the smaller rehearsal rooms before her actual shifts began. One afternoon, he found himself standing outside that rehearsal room, listening to her play through an open doorway. The piece was unfamiliar to him, something delicate yet powerful, filled with the same emotional depth he had witnessed weeks earlier. He remained there until the final note faded, unwilling to interrupt something that felt almost sacred. When Mara finally noticed him standing there, she offered a small smile rather than her usual reserved caution. "Come to laugh again?" she asked, though her tone carried no real edge. Julian shook his head, stepping into the room. "Come to listen," he corrected. "Properly. This time." Their relationship, once defined entirely by mockery and misunderstanding, had gradually shifted into something resembling genuine friendship. Julian began asking Mara questions about interpretation, about emotional phrasing, about the way she managed to infuse simple passages with such profound feeling. Mara, in turn, found herself opening up more freely than she had with anyone since her grandmother's passing, sharing not just technical insight but pieces of her own story that she had kept hidden for years. However, not everyone within the conservatory welcomed this shift with equal enthusiasm. Some students, particularly those who had long admired Julian's untouchable reputation, began expressing quiet resentment toward Mara's sudden rise. Whispers circulated that perhaps she had manipulated her way into the scholarship, that perhaps her story had been exaggerated for sympathy, that perhaps Mr. Caldwell had simply grown sentimental in his later years. One student in particular, a talented pianist named Nora who had long positioned herself as Julian's closest rival, seemed especially unsettled by Mara's growing presence. Nora approached Julian one afternoon during a break between lessons, her tone laced with thinly veiled frustration. "You've been spending a lot of time with the janitor," Nora said, emphasizing the word deliberately. "Her name is Mara," Julian replied evenly. no longer willing to entertain the dismissive tone he himself had once used. Nora raised an eyebrow. "Careful, Julian. People are starting to talk." "Let them talk," he said simply, surprising even himself with his own indifference toward gossip that once would have mattered a great deal to him. Despite the whispers, Mara continued advancing steadily under her new instructors, relearning techniques she had once mastered while also developing new approaches to pieces she hadn't encountered before. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Years without formal training had left certain gaps in her technical consistency, and she often found herself frustrated during lessons when her fingers failed to execute passages with the precision she remembered from her youth. During one particularly difficult session, her instructor, a patient woman named Ingrid, paused the lesson after Mara stumbled through a passage for the third consecutive time. "You're overthinking," Ingrid said gently. "You're trying to play the way you did as a teenager, instead of allowing yourself to play as the person you are now." Mara exhaled slowly, frustration evident in her tense shoulders. "I just want to prove I deserve this opportunity." "You've already proven that," Ingrid replied. "Now you need to trust it." That evening, after another long day of lessons layered on top of her usual work shifts, Mara found Julian waiting for her outside the conservatory's main entrance. "Rough day?" he asked, noticing the exhaustion evident on her face. "Rough month," she admitted with a tired laugh. "Walk with me," he offered. They walked together through the quiet evening streets, the conversation drifting easily between music, memories, and the strange, unexpected friendship that had formed between them. Julian found himself sharing details about his own life he rarely discussed with anyone: the pressure of his family's expectations, the constant fear that his success stemmed more from privilege than genuine skill, the loneliness that often accompanied being surrounded by people who admired him without truly knowing him. Mara listened carefully, recognizing pieces of her own insecurities reflected in his words, despite their vastly different circumstances. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "we've both been carrying things we were too afraid to set down." Julian nodded slowly, considering her words. "Maybe that's why that one note affected me so much. It felt like someone finally being honest, when everyone around me spends so much energy pretending." As weeks passed, Mara's progress became increasingly evident, not just to her instructors, but to the entire conservatory community. She was selected to perform a small piece during an upcoming showcase event, an opportunity typically reserved for the school's most accomplished students. The announcement sparked renewed whispers throughout the hallways, though this time, admiration began outweighing skepticism among most students. Nora, however, remained visibly unsettled by Mara's rapid rise, her resentment growing with each passing week. She approached Mr. Caldwell privately, questioning whether it was appropriate for someone with such limited recent training to perform alongside students who had dedicated years exclusively to formal study. Mr. Caldwell listened patiently before responding firmly. "Talent isn't measured solely by consistent access to opportunity," he said. "Sometimes it's measured by resilience, despite the absence of it." Nora left the conversation unsatisfied, though she chose not to pursue the matter further, at least not directly. Meanwhile, Julian began quietly supporting Mara's preparation for the showcase, offering feedback during her practice sessions, encouraging her whenever self-doubt threatened to resurface. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent moments of genuine support neither of them had expected to find within the walls of a school that once felt divided sharply between privilege and struggle. One evening, just days before the showcase, Mara sat alone in the rehearsal room long after everyone else had left, running through her piece one final time. Her fingers moved with growing confidence, each note landing with the same emotional depth that had first silenced an entire hallway weeks earlier. Julian arrived quietly, leaning against the doorway as he had done many times before, though this time he said nothing, allowing her music to fill the space uninterrupted. When she finished, he offered a small, genuine smile. "You're ready," he said simply. "You think so?" Mara asked, uncertainty still lingering beneath her growing confidence. "I know so," Julian replied. "You've always been ready. Life just made you wait longer than you should have had to." Mara felt a quiet warmth settle over her, gratitude mixing with nervous anticipation about the performance ahead. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to fully believe that the version of herself she had once buried beneath years of hardship was finally ready to step back into the light. As the showcase date approached, tension within the conservatory grew increasingly palpable. Students whispered predictions about how the audience would react to a performer whose story had become impossible to ignore. Some anticipated triumph. Others, particularly those aligned with Nora's skepticism, anticipated failure. Mara, however, focused entirely on her preparation, refusing to allow outside opinions to shake the fragile confidence she had worked so hard to rebuild. The night before the showcase, she visited her mother, sharing details about everything that had unfolded since accepting the scholarship. Diane listened with quiet pride, her eyes glistening with emotion as her daughter described how far she had come. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you," Diane said softly. Mara nodded, tears threatening once again. "I wish she could be here to see it." "She will be," Diane replied gently, "in every note you play." That night, Mara returned home, laying awake long after the house had gone quiet, thoughts drifting between nervousness and hope. Tomorrow, she would step onto a stage for the first time in years, no longer hiding behind a mop and cleaning cart, no longer burying the truth of who she really was. Tomorrow, she would finally play not as a memory of who she used to be, but as the person she had fought so hard to become again. The auditorium filled quickly on the evening of the showcase, rows of seats occupied by parents, faculty, and students, eager to witness the school's most talented performers. Backstage, Mara stood quietly near the curtain, her hands trembling slightly despite the confidence she had worked so hard to rebuild over the previous weeks. Julian found her there moments before the event began, offering a reassuring presence rather than empty words. "Whatever happens out there," he said quietly, "you've already proven everything you needed to prove." Mara nodded, grateful for his steady support. "Thank you for believing in me, even when you had no reason to." "I had every reason," Julian replied with a small smile. "I just needed one note to realize it." The showcase began with several impressive performances from other students, each demonstrating years of dedicated training and technical mastery. Nora performed early in the program, delivering a flawless, precise rendition of a challenging piece that earned enthusiastic applause. Her performance served as a clear reminder of the high standard Mara would be expected to match. When Mara's name was finally announced, a ripple of anticipation moved through the audience. Many had heard fragments of her story by now, whispered rumors about a janitor-turned-scholarship recipient, though few truly understood the depth of everything she had overcome to reach this moment. She walked onto the stage slowly, her uniform replaced for the evening by a simple, elegant dress her mother had helped her choose. The stage lights felt unfamiliar against her skin, yet strangely welcoming, as though some forgotten part of her had been waiting patiently to return to exactly this moment. She settled onto the piano bench, closing her eyes briefly to steady her breathing. In the front row, Diane sat with her hands clasped tightly together, eyes already glistening with anticipation. Beside her sat Mr. Caldwell, watching with quiet confidence in the decision he had made weeks earlier. Mara placed her fingers on the keys, allowing herself one final moment of stillness before beginning. The first notes emerged softly, delicate and controlled, immediately capturing the audience's full attention. As the piece progressed, her playing grew increasingly powerful, each phrase carrying layers of emotion built from years of hardship, loss, resilience, and quiet hope. The piece, one her grandmother had taught her long ago, seemed to tell an entire story without a single word being spoken, a story of sacrifice, struggle, and the unbreakable pull toward something meaningful, despite every obstacle placed in its way. The audience sat in complete silence, captivated entirely by the raw honesty pouring from the stage. Julian, watching from the wings, felt a lump form in his throat, understanding now more than ever the difference between technical perfection and genuine feeling. When Mara reached the piece's final passage, her fingers moved with a combination of strength and vulnerability that filled the auditorium with an almost tangible energy. As the last note faded into silence, a beat of complete stillness followed, the kind of silence that only exists after something truly extraordinary has occurred. Then the applause erupted, rising quickly into a standing ovation that filled the entire auditorium. Diane stood immediately, tears streaming freely down her face, clapping with a pride too large to contain. Mr. Caldwell rose as well, nodding with quiet satisfaction, certain now more than ever that his decision to offer Mara a second chance had been entirely justified. Mara sat frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the response, before finally rising to offer a small, humble bow. Her eyes found her mother in the crowd, and something unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, relief, and years of shared struggle finally rewarded with a moment neither of them had dared to fully imagine. Backstage, Julian greeted her with genuine admiration, his earlier arrogance now completely replaced by respect. "That was the most honest performance I've ever heard," he said sincerely. "Thank you," Mara replied, still catching her breath from the overwhelming response. "For everything. For believing in me when it mattered most." Nora approached shortly afterward, her earlier skepticism visibly shaken. "I owe you an apology," she admitted quietly. I misjudged you completely. Mara offered a gracious smile. It's all right. People often judge what they don't yet understand. Word of Mara's performance spread quickly beyond the conservatory itself, eventually reaching local music circles that had long admired the school's talented students. Within weeks, she received invitations to perform at small community events, opportunities that gradually expanded her reputation beyond the walls of the institution where she had once quietly mopped floors in secret. Mr. Caldwell continued mentoring her closely, ensuring she received the guidance necessary to fully develop the skills that had remained dormant for years. Under his supervision, Mara balanced her studies with occasional teaching opportunities, eventually working with younger students who reminded her deeply of her own early years under her grandmother's patient guidance. Julian, meanwhile, underwent his own quiet transformation. Determined to understand the emotional depth Mara brought so naturally to her playing, he began approaching his own music differently, focusing less on technical perfection and more on genuine connection with the pieces he performed. His playing, once admired primarily for its precision, gradually developed a new richness that critics and instructors alike began to notice. One afternoon, several months after the showcase, Julian approached Mara during one of her practice sessions, carrying a request he had never imagined making to anyone before. "Would you teach me?" he asked. "Not technique. I already have that. I want to learn what you understand about feeling." Mara studied him for a long moment, remembering the arrogant boy who had once mocked her in this very hall, now standing before her with genuine humility. "I think," she said with a small smile, "we could learn from each other." Their friendship, born from an unlikely confrontation months earlier, continued deepening into a partnership built on mutual respect and shared passion. They often practiced together after hours, exchanging techniques, discussing interpretation, and rediscovering the pure joy of music that both had, in different ways, nearly lost beneath layers of hardship and pressure. As the school year drew to a close, Mara received an invitation to perform at a regional showcase event, an opportunity that would introduce her talent to an audience far beyond the conservatory's familiar walls. She accepted immediately, determined to honor both her grandmother's memory and her mother's unwavering support throughout years of struggle. On the evening of the regional performance, Diane sat proudly in the audience once again, joined this time by Mr. Caldwell and several conservatory students who had come to support her, including Julian, who watched from backstage with quiet pride rather than the arrogant curiosity that had first brought their paths together. As Mara walked onto the stage once more, she paused briefly, allowing herself a moment of gratitude for everything that had led her back to this exact place. She thought of her grandmother's gentle guidance, her mother's endless sacrifice, and the unexpected friendship that had helped her rediscover confidence she thought she had lost forever. She sat at the piano, placed her fingers gently on the keys, and began to play. The music flowed effortlessly, each note carrying not just technical mastery, but the full weight of everything she had lived through, everything she had lost, and everything she had finally reclaimed. The audience listened in complete silence, captivated entirely by a performance that felt less like a demonstration of skill and more like an honest, unguarded piece of someone's soul. When the final note faded into silence, the auditorium erupted once again into enthusiastic applause, confirming what everyone who had witnessed her journey already knew to be true. Mara Whitfield was no longer hiding. She had spent years believing her story with music had ended the moment circumstances forced her away from the piano. But sitting there, bathed in warm stage lights, surrounded by people who had come to believe in her as fiercely as she now believed in herself, she understood clearly that her story hadn't ended at all. It had simply been waiting, patiently, for the right moment to begin again. And this time, she intended to make sure the world was listening.